It was early in April in the year 83 that I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing fully dressed by the side of my bed. He was a late riser, as a rule, and as the clock on the mantelpiece showed me that it was only 7:15, I blinked up at him in some surprise. "What is it, a fire?" "No, a client. It seems that a young lady has arrived in a considerable state of excitement who insists upon seeing me." I rapidly threw on my clothes and was ready in a few minutes to accompany my friend down to the sitting-room. A lady dressed in black and heavily veiled, who had been sitting in the window, rose as we entered. "Good morning, madam," said Holmes cheerily. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my intimate friend and associate, Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak as freely as before myself. I am glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has had the good sense to light the fire. Pray draw up to it, and I shall order you a cup of hot coffee, for I observe that you are shivering." "It is not cold which makes me shiver," said the woman. "What then?" "It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror." She raised her veil as she spoke, and we could see that she was indeed in a pitiable state of agitation. Her features and figure were those of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with premature grey, and her expression was weary and haggard. "You must not fear," said he, bending forward and patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right, I have no doubt. You have come in by train this morning, I see. You know me, then?" "No, but I observed the second half of a return ticket inside the palm of your left glove. You must have started early, and yet you had a good drive in a dog-cart along heavy roads before you reached the station." The lady stared in bewilderment at my companion. "There is no mystery, my dear madam," said he, smiling. "The left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are perfectly fresh. There is no vehicle save a dog-cart which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver." "Whatever your reasons may be, you are perfectly correct," said she. "Oh, sir, do you not think that you could help me?" "I am all attention, madam." "My name is Helen Stoner, and I live with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran, on the western border of Surrey." Holmes nodded his head. "The name is familiar to me," said he. "When Dr. Roylott was in India, he married my mother, Mrs. Stoner, the young widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were twins, and we were only 2 years old at the time of my mother's remarriage. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott entirely while we resided with him, with a provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. Shortly after our return to England, my mother died. She was killed 8 years ago in a railway accident near Crewe. Dr. Roylott then abandoned his attempts to establish himself in practice in London and took us to live with him in the old ancestral house at Stoke Moran. The money which my mother had left was enough for all our wants, and there seemed to be no obstacle to our happiness. But a terrible change came over my stepfather about this time. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbours, who had at first been overjoyed to see a Roylott of Stoke Moran back in the old family seat, he shut himself up in his house and seldom came out, save to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whomever might cross his path. He had no friends at all, save the wandering gypsies, and he would give these vagabonds leave to encamp upon the few acres of bramble-covered land which represent the family estate. He has a passion also for Indian animals, which are sent over to him by a correspondent, and he has at this very moment a cheetah and a baboon which wander freely over his grounds and are feared by the villagers almost as much as their master. You can imagine from what I say that my poor sister Julia and I had no great pleasure in our lives. She was but 30 at the time of her death, and her hair had already begun to whiten, even as mine has." "Your sister is dead, then?" "Yes, it is of her death that I wish to speak to you in part. At Christmas 2 years ago, my sister met a half-pay major of Marines to whom she became engaged. My stepfather learned of it and offered no objection to the marriage, but within a fortnight of the day which had been fixed for the wedding, the terrible event occurred which has deprived me of my only companion." Sherlock Holmes had been leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed and his head sunk in a cushion, but he half opened his lids now and glanced across at his visitor. "Pray be precise as to details," said he. The manor house is very old, and only one wing is now inhabited. The first bedroom is Dr. Rollett's, the second my sister's, and the third my own. On the fatal night, Dr. Rollett had gone to his room early, though we knew that he had not retired to rest, for my sister was troubled by the smell of the strong Indian cigars which it was his custom to smoke. She left her room, therefore, and came into mine, where she sat for some time, chatting about her approaching wedding. At 11 o'clock she rose to leave me, but she paused at the door and looked back. "Tell me, Helen," said she, "have you ever heard anyone whistle in the dead of the night?" "Never," said I. "I suppose that you could not possibly whistle yourself in your sleep." "Oh, certainly not, but why?" "Because during the last few nights I have always, about 3 o'clock in the morning, heard a low, clear whistle. I'm a light sleeper, and it has awakened me. I cannot tell where it came from, perhaps from the next room, perhaps from the lawn. I thought that I would just ask you whether you had heard it." "No, I have not." "It must be those wretched gypsies in the plantation." "Very likely. Well, it is of no great consequence at any rate." She smiled back at me, closed my door, and a few moments later I heard her key turn in the lock. "Indeed," said Holmes. "Was it your custom always to lock yourself in at night?" "Always." "And why?" "I think that I mentioned to you that the doctor kept a cheetah and a baboon." "Oh, quite so. Pray proceed with your statement." "I could not sleep that night. A vague feeling of impending misfortune impressed me. It was a wild night. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was beating and splashing against the windows. Suddenly, amid all the hubbub of the gale, there burst forth the wild scream of a terrified woman. I knew that it was my sister's voice. I sprang from my bed, wrapped a shawl round me, and rushed into the corridor. As I ran down the passage, my sister's door was unlocked and revolved slowly upon its hinges. I stared at it, horror-stricken, not knowing what was about to issue from it. By the light of the corridor lamp, I saw my sister appear at the opening. I ran to her and threw my arms about her. But at that moment her knees seemed to give way, and she fell to the ground. She writhed as one who is in terrible pain, and her limbs were dreadfully convulsed. As I bent over her, she suddenly shrieked out in a voice which I shall never forget, "Oh, my God, Helen! It was the band, the Speckled band!" I rushed out, calling loudly for my stepfather, and I met him hastening from his room in his dressing gown. When he reached my sister's side, she was unconscious, and though he poured brandy down her throat and sent for medical aid from the village, all efforts were in vain, for she slowly sank and died without having recovered her consciousness. "And what conclusions did the coroner come to?" "He investigated the case with great care, for Dr. Rollett's conduct had long been notorious in the county, but he was unable to find any satisfactory cause of death. There were no marks of any violence upon her." "How about poison?" "The doctors examined her for it, but without success." "Were there gypsies in the plantation at the time?" "Yes, there are nearly always some there." "Ah. And what did you gather from this allusion to a band, a speckled band?" "Well, sometimes I've thought that it was merely the wild talk of delirium, sometimes that it may have referred to some band of people, perhaps to those very gypsies in the plantation. The spotted handkerchiefs which so many of them wear might have suggested the strange adjective which she used." Holmes shook his head like a man who is far from satisfied. "These are very deep waters," said he. "Pray go on with your narrative." 2 years have passed since then, and my life has been until lately lonelier than ever. A month ago, however, a dear friend whom I have known for many years has done me the honour to ask my hand in marriage. My stepfather has offered no opposition to the match, and we are to be married in the course of the spring. 2 days ago, some repairs were started in the west wing of the building, so that I have had to move into the chamber in which my sister died and to sleep in the very bed in which she slept. Imagine then my thrill of terror when last night, as I lay awake thinking over her terrible fate, I suddenly heard in the silence of the night the low whistle which had been the herald of her own death. I sprang up and lit the lamp, but nothing was to be seen in the room. I was too shaken to go to bed again, however, so I dressed, and as soon as it was daylight I slipped down, got a dog cart at the Crown Inn, which is opposite, and drove to Leatherhead, from whence I have come on this morning with the one object of seeing you and asking your advice." You have done wisely, said my friend. But have you told me all? Yes, all. Miss Roylott, you have not. You are screening your stepfather. What? What do you mean? For answer, Holmes pushed back the frill of black lace which fringed the hand that lay upon our visitor's knee. 5 little livid spots, the marks of 4 fingers and a thumb, were printed upon the white wrist. You have been cruelly used, said Holmes. The lady coloured deeply and covered over her injured wrist. He is a hard man, she said, and perhaps he hardly knows his own strength. Holmes leaned his chin upon his hands and stared into the crackling fire. If we were to come to Stoke Moran today, would it be possible for us to see over these rooms without the knowledge of your stepfather? Oh, yes, she replied. He will be away all day, and there would be nothing to disturb you. I shall return by the 12 o'clock train, so as to be there in time for your coming. She dropped her thick black veil over her face and glided from the room. "And what do you think of it all, Watson?" asked Sherlock Holmes, leaning back in his chair. "I cannot think. When you combine the ideas of whistles at night, the presence of a band of gypsies who are on intimate terms with this old doctor... But what then? I mean, what did the gypsies do? I cannot imagine. It is precisely for that reason that we are going to Stoke Moran this day. I want to see whether... But what in the name of the devil?" The ejaculation had been drawn from my companion by the fact that our door had been suddenly dashed open and that a huge man had framed himself in the aperture. So tall was he that his hat actually brushed the crossbar of the doorway, and his breadth seemed to span it across from side to side. A large face, seared with 1,000 wrinkles, burned yellow with the sun and marked with every evil passion, was turned from one to the other of us, while his deep-set, bile-shot eyes and his high, thin, fleshless nose gave him somewhat the resemblance to a fierce old bird of prey. "Which of you is Holmes?" asked this apparition. "My name, sir. But you have the advantage of me," said my companion quietly. "I am Dr. Grimsby Roylott of Stoke Moran." "Indeed, doctor," said Holmes. "Pray take a seat." "I will do nothing of the kind. My stepdaughter has been here. I have traced her. What has she been saying to you?" "It is a little cold for the time of the year," said Holmes. "What has she been saying to you?" "I know you, you scoundrel. I have heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler." My friend smiled. "Holmes the busybody." Holmes' smile broadened. "Holmes the Scotland Yard jack-in-office." Holmes chuckled heartily. "Your conversation is most entertaining," said he. "When you go out, close the door, for there is a decided draught." "I will go when I've had my say. Don't you dare meddle in my affairs. I know that Miss Toner has been here. I traced her. I'm a dangerous man to fall foul of." He stepped swiftly forward, seized the poker, and bent it into a curve with his huge brown hands. "See that you keep yourself out of my grip," he snarled. And hurling the twisted poker into the fireplace, he strode out of the room. "He seems a very amiable person," said Holmes, laughing and picking up the poker. With a sudden effort, he straightened it out again. "Fancy his having the insolence to confound me with the official detective force. But, Watson, I should be very much obliged if you would slip your revolver into your pocket. An Ely's number 2 is an excellent argument with gentlemen who can twist pokers into knots. That and a toothbrush are, I think, all that we need." At Waterloo, we were fortunate in catching a train for Leatherhead, where we hired a trap at the station inn and drove for 4 or 5 miles through the lovely Surrey lanes. Upon our arrival, our client of the morning hurried forward to meet us with a face which spoke her joy. "I have been waiting so eagerly for you," she cried. "All has turned out splendidly. Dr. Roylott has gone to town, and it is unlikely that he will be back before evening." "We have had the pleasure of making the doctor's acquaintance," said Holmes. And in a few words he sketched out what had occurred. Miss Toner turned white to the lips as she listened. "Oh, good heaven," she cried. "He has followed me, then?" "So it appears." Holmes walked slowly up and down the ill-trimmed lawn and examined with deep attention the outside of the windows. "Now," he said, "would you have the kindness to go into your room and bar your shutters?" Miss Stoner did so, and Holmes, after a careful examination, endeavoured in every way to force the shutters open, but without success. There was no slit through which a knife could be passed to raise the bar. Said he. Well, we shall see if the inside throws any light upon the matter. A small side door led into the whitewashed corridor from which the 3 rooms opened. We passed at once to the second, that in which Miss Stoner was now sleeping, and in which her sister had met with her fate. It was a homely little room with a low ceiling and a gaping fireplace, after the fashion of old country houses. Holmes drew one of the chairs into a corner and sat silent, while his eyes travelled round and up and down, taking in every detail of the apartment. "Where does that bell communicate with?" he asked at last, pointing to a thick bell rope which hung down beside the bed, the tassel actually lying upon the pillow. "It goes to the housekeeper's room. It looks newer than the other things." "Yes, it was only put there a couple of years ago." "Your sister asked for it, I suppose?" "No, I never heard of her using it." "Indeed. You'll excuse me for a few minutes while I satisfy myself as to this floor." He threw himself down upon his face with his lens in his hand and crawled swiftly backward and forward, examining minutely the cracks between the boards. Finally, he walked over to the bed and spent some time in staring at it and in running his eye up and down the wall. Then he took the bell rope in his hand and gave it a brisk tug. "Why, it's a dummy," said he. "Won't it ring?" "No, it's not even attached to a wire." "This is very interesting. You can see now that it is fastened to a hook just above where the little opening of the ventilator is." "Oh, how very absurd. I never noticed that before." "Very strange," muttered Holmes, pulling at the rope. "There are 1 or 2 very singular points about this room. For example, well, a fool a builder must be to open a ventilator into another room when, with the same trouble, he might have communicated with the outside air." "Oh, that is also quite modern," said the lady. "Done about the same time as the bell rope?" remarked Holmes. "Yes, there were several little changes carried out about that time." "With your permission, Miss Stoner, we shall now carry our researches into the inner apartment." Dr. Grimsby Roylett's chamber was larger than that of his stepdaughter, but was as plainly furnished. A camp bed, a plain wooden chair against the wall, and a large iron safe were the principal things which met the eye. Holmes walked slowly round and examined each and all of them with the keenest interest. "What is here?" he asked, tapping the safe. "Oh, my stepfather's business papers." "Oh. You've seen inside them?" "Only once, some years ago." "There isn't a cat in it, for example?" No. No, what a strange idea." "Well, look at this." He took up a small saucer of milk which stood on the top of it. "No, we don't keep a cat, but there is a cheetah and a baboon." "Ah, yes, of course. Well, a cheetah is just a big cat, and yet—" He squatted down in front of the wooden chair and examined the seat of it with the greatest attention. "Thank you. That is quite settled," said he, rising and putting his lens in his pocket. "Hello, here's something interesting." The object which had caught his eye was a small dog lash, hung on one corner of the bed. The lash, however, was curled upon itself and tied so as to make a loop of whipcord. "What do you make of that, Watson?" "It's a common enough lash, but I don't know why it should be tied." "That is not quite so common, is it?" Ah, me. I'd never seen my friend's face so grim or his brow so dark as it was when we turned from the scene of this investigation. We walked several times up and down the lawn, neither Miss Stoner nor myself liking to break in upon his thoughts. "It is very essential, Miss Stoner," said he, "that you should absolutely follow my advice in every respect. I assure you that I am in your hands. In the first place, both my friend and I must spend the night in your room." Both Miss Stoner and I gazed at him in astonishment. "Yes, it must be so. You must confine yourself to your room on pretence of a headache when your stepfather comes back. Then, when you hear him retire for the night, you must open the shutters of your window, undo the hasp, put your lamp there as a signal to us, and then withdraw quietly into the room which you used to occupy. The rest you will leave in our hands." "Oh, for pity's sake, tell me what was the cause of my sister's death?" I should prefer to have clearer proof before I speak. Sherlock Holmes and I had no difficulty in engaging a bedroom and a sitting room at the Crown Inn. They were on the upper floor, and from our window we could command a view of Stoke-Moran. At dusk, we saw Dr. Grimsby Roylott drive past, his huge form looming up beside the little figure of the lad who drove him. The boy had some slight difficulty in undoing the heavy iron gates, and we heard the hoarse roar of the doctor's voice and saw the fury with which he shook his fists at him. "You know, Watson," said Holmes, as we sat together in the gathering darkness, "I've really some scruples as to taking you tonight. There is a distinct element of danger. Can I be of assistance? Your presence might be invaluable. Then I shall certainly come. It's very kind of you." 2 hours passed slowly away, and then, suddenly, just at the stroke of 11, a single bright light shone right out in front of us. "That is our signal," said Holmes, springing to his feet. "It comes from the middle window." Making our way among the trees, we reached the lawn, crossed it, and were about to enter through the window when, out from a clump of laurel bushes, there darted what seemed to be a hideous and distorted child who threw itself upon the grass with writhing limbs and then ran swiftly across the lawn into the darkness. "My God," I whispered. "Did you see that?" Holmes was for a moment as startled as I. Then he broke into a low laugh and put his lips to my ear. "It is a nice household," he murmured. "That is the baboon." I had forgotten the strange pets which the doctor affected. There was a cheetah, too. Perhaps we might find it upon our shoulders at any moment. I confess that I felt easier in my mind when, after following Holmes' example and slipping off my shoes, I found myself inside the bedroom. My companion noiselessly closed the shutters, moved the lamp onto the table, and cast his eyes round the room. Then, creeping up to me and making a trumpet of his hand, he whispered into my ear again so gently that it was all I could do to distinguish the words. "The least sound would be fatal to our plans." I nodded to show that I'd heard. "We must sit without light. He would see it through the ventilator." I nodded again. "Do not go asleep. Your very life may depend upon it. Have your pistol ready in case we should need it. I will sit on the side of the bed, and you in that chair." I took out my revolver and laid it on the corner of the table. Holmes had brought up a long, thin cane, and this he placed upon the bed beside him. Then he turned down the lamp, and we were left in darkness. How shall I ever forget that dreadful vigil? I could not hear a sound, not even the drawing of a breath, and yet I knew that my companion sat open-eyed within a few feet of me, in the same state of nervous tension in which I was myself. From outside came the occasional cry of a night bird, and once, at our very window, a long-drawn, cat-like whine told us that the cheetah was indeed at liberty. Far away, 12 struck, and 1, and 2, and 3, and still we sat, waiting silently for whatever might befall. Suddenly there was the momentary gleam of a light in the direction of the ventilator, which vanished immediately. Somewhere in the next room had lit a dark lantern. I heard a gentle sound of movement, and then all was silent once more. I sat with straining ears. Then suddenly another sound became audible, a very gentle, soothing sound like that of a small jet of steam escaping continually from a kettle. The instant that we heard it, Holmes sprang from the bed, struck a match, and lashed furiously with his cane at the bell pull. "You see it, Watson?" he yelled. "You see it?" But I saw nothing. At the moment when Holmes struck the light, I heard a low, clear whistle, but the sudden glare flashing into my weary eyes made it impossible for me to tell what it was at which my friend lashed so savagely. I could only see that his face was deadly pale and filled with horror and loathing. He had ceased to strike and was gazing up at the ventilator when suddenly there broke from the silence of the night the most horrible cry to which I have ever listened. It swelled up louder and louder, a hoarse yell of pain and fear and anger, all mixed in one dreadful shriek. "What can it mean?" I gasped. "It means that all is over," Holmes answered. "Take your pistol and we will enter Dr. Rollitt's room." With a grey face he lit the lamp and led the way down the corridor. Twice he struck at the chamber door without any reply from within. Then he turned the handle and entered, I at his heels, with a cocked pistol in my hand. It was a singular sight which met our eyes. On the table stood a dark lantern with the shutter half open, throwing a brilliant beam of light upon the iron safe, the door of which was ajar. Beside this table, on the wooden chair, sat Dr. Grimsby Roylott, clad in a long grey dressing gown, his bare ankles protruding beneath. Across his lap lay the short stock with a long lash, which we had noticed during the day. His chin was cocked upward, and his eyes were fixed in a dreadful, rigid stare at the corner of the ceiling. Round his brow he had a peculiar yellow band with brownish speckles, which seemed to be bound tightly round his head. As we entered, he made neither sound nor motion. "The band! The speckled band!" whispered Holmes. I took a step forward. In an instant this strange headgear began to move, and there reared itself from among his hair the squat, diamond-shaped head and puffed neck of a loathsome serpent. "It's a swamp adder," cried Holmes, "the deadliest snake in India. He has died within 10 seconds of being bitten." As he spoke, he drew the dog whip swiftly from the dead man's lap, and throwing the noose round the reptile's neck, he drew it from its horrid perch, and carrying it at arm's length, threw it into the iron safe, which he closed upon it. The little which I had yet to learn of the case was told me by Sherlock Holmes as we travelled back next day. My attention was speedily drawn, as I've already remarked to you, to this ventilator and to the bell rope which hung down to the bed. The idea of a snake instantly occurred to me, and when I coupled it with my knowledge that the doctor was furnished with a supply of creatures from India, I felt that I was probably on the right track. Then I thought of the whistle. Of course, he must recall the snake before the morning light revealed it to the victim. He had trained it probably by the use of the milk which we saw, to return to him when summoned. He would put it through this ventilator at the hour that he thought best, with the certainty that it would crawl down the rope and land on the bed. It might or might not bite the occupant. Perhaps she might escape every night for a week, but sooner or later she must fall a victim. An inspection of his chair showed me that he had been in the habit of standing on it, which, of course, would be necessary in order that he should reach the ventilator. Having once made up my mind, you know the steps which I took in order to put the matter to the proof. I am no doubt indirectly responsible for Dr. Grimsby Roylott's death, but I cannot say that it is likely to weigh very heavily upon my conscience. It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these, the last words in which I shall ever record the singular gifts by which my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was distinguished. In an incoherent, and, as I deeply feel, an entirely inadequate fashion, I have endeavoured to give some account of my strange experiences in his company. But it was my intention to have said nothing of that event which has created a void in my life which the lapse of 2 years has done little to fill. My hand has been forced, however, by the recent letters in which Colonel James Moriarty defends the memory of his brother, and I have no choice but to lay these facts before the public exactly as they occurred. It lies with me to tell for the first time what really took place between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It may be remembered that after my marriage and my subsequent start in private practice, the very intimate relations which had existed between Holmes and myself became, to some extent, modified. He still came to me from time to time when he desired a companion in his investigations, but these occasions grew more and more seldom. It was with some surprise, therefore, that I saw him walk into my consulting room upon the evening of April the 24th. It struck me that he was looking even paler and thinner than usual. "Yes, I've been using myself up rather too freely," he remarked, in answer to my look rather than my words. "I have been a little pressed of late." Holmes edged his way round the wall, and flinging the shutters together, he bolted them securely. "You're afraid of something?" I asked. "Well, I am." "Of what?" "Of air guns." "My dear Holmes, what do you mean?" "I think that you know me well enough, Watson, to understand that I am by no means a nervous man. At the same time, it is stupidity rather than courage to refuse to recognize danger when it is close upon you." "I must apologize for calling so late," said he. "And I must further beg you to be so unconventional as to allow me to leave your house presently by scrambling over your back garden wall." "But what does it all mean?" I asked. He held out his hand, and I saw in the light of the lamp the two of his knuckles were burst and bleeding. "It's not an airy nothing, you see," said he, smiling. "On the contrary, it is solid enough for a man to break his hand over. Is Mrs. Watson in?" "She's away upon a visit." "Indeed. You're alone?" "Quite." "Then it makes it easier for me to propose that you come away with me for a week to the continent." "Where?" "Oh, anywhere. It's all the same to me." There was something very strange in all this. It was not Holmes' nature to take an aimless holiday, and something about his pale, worn face told me that his nerves were at their highest tension. He saw the question in my eyes, and putting his fingertips together and his elbows upon his knees, he explained the situation. "You have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty," said he. "Never. Aye, there's the genius and the wonder of the thing," he cried. "The man pervades London, and no one has heard of him. I tell you, Watson, in all seriousness, that if I could beat that man, if I could free society of him, I should feel that my own career had reached its summit, and I should be prepared to turn to some more placid line of life. But I could not rest, Watson. I could not sit quiet in my chair if I thought that such a man as Professor Moriarty were walking the streets of London unchallenged." "What has he done, then?" "His career has been an extraordinary one. He's a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21, he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem, which has had a European vogue. On the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair of one of our smaller universities and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. As you are aware, Watson, there is no one who knows the higher criminal world of London so well as I do. For years past, I have continually been conscious of some power behind the malefactor, some deep organizing power which forever stands in the way of the law and throws its shield over the wrongdoer. For years I have endeavored to break through the veil which shrouded it, and at last the time came when I seized my thread and followed it until it led me, after 1,000 cunning windings, to ex-Professor Moriarty of mathematical celebrity. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. He sits motionless like a spider in the center of its web. But that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows well every quiver of each of them. He does little himself. He only plans. Is there a crime to be done, a paper to be abstracted, a house to be rifled, a man to be removed? The word is passed to the professor, the matter is organized and carried out. The agent may be caught, but the central power which uses the agent is never caught, never so much as suspected. This was the organization which I deduced, Watson, but do what I would, it seemed impossible to get evidence which would convict in a court of law. You know my powers, my dear Watson, and yet at the end of 3 months I was forced to confess that I had at last met an antagonist who was my intellectual equal. My horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration at his skill. But at last he made a trip. Only a little trip. But it was more than he could afford when I was so close upon him. I had my chance, and starting from that point, I have woven my net round him until now it is all ready to close. In 3 days, that is to say, on Monday next, matters will be ripe, and the professor, with all the principal members of his gang, will be in the hands of the police. Now, if I could have done this without the knowledge of Professor Moriarty, all would have been well. But he was too wily for that. He saw every step which I took to draw my toils round him. Again and again he strove to break away, but I as often headed him off. Never have I risen to such a height, and never have I been so hard pressed by an opponent. This morning the last steps were taken. and 3 days only were wanted to complete the business. I was sitting in my room thinking the matter over when the door opened and Professor Moriarty stood before me. My nerves are fairly proof, Watson, but I must confess to a start when I saw the very man who had been so much in my thoughts standing there on my threshold. His appearance was quite familiar to me. He is extremely tall and thin. His forehead domes out in a white curve, and his 2 eyes are deeply sunken in his head. His shoulders are rounded from much study, and his face protrudes forward and is forever slowly oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian fashion. He peered at me with great curiosity in his puckered eyes. "You have less frontal development than I would have expected," said he at last. "It's a dangerous habit to finger loaded firearms in the pocket of one's dressing gown." The fact is that upon his entrance I had instantly recognized the extreme personal danger in which I lay. The only conceivable escape for him lay in silencing my tongue. At his remark, I drew the weapon out and laid it cocked upon the table. He smiled and blinked, but there was something about his eyes which made me feel very glad that I had it there. "You evidently don't know me," said he. "On the contrary," I answered, "I think it is fairly evident that I do. Pray take a chair. I can spare you 5 minutes, if you have anything to say." "All that I have to say has already crossed your mind," said he. "Then possibly my answer has crossed yours," I replied. "You stand fast?" "Absolutely." He clapped his hand into his pocket, and I erased the pistol from the table, but he merely drew out a memorandum book in which he had scribbled some dates. "You crossed my path on the 4th of January, said he. "On the 23rd you incommoded me. In the middle of February I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March I was absolutely hampered in my plans, and now at the close of April the situation is becoming an impossible one." "Have you any suggestion to make?" I asked. "You must drop it, Mr. Holmes," said he, swaying his face about. "You really must, you know." "After Monday," said I. "Tut, tut," said he. "I am quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see there can be but one outcome. It has been an intellectual treat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this affair, and I say unaffectedly that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take extreme measures." "Danger is a part of my trade," I remarked. "This is not danger," said he. "It is inevitable destruction. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you." "You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty," said I. "Let me pay you one in return when I say that if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interests of the public, cheerfully accept the latter." "I can promise you the one, but not the other." He turned his rounded back upon me and went peering and blinking out of the room. I went out about midday to transact some business. As I passed the corner which leads onto Welbeck Street crossing, a 2-horse van whizzed round and was on me like a flash. I sprang and saved myself by the fraction of a second. I kept to the pavement after that, Watson, but as I walked down Vere Street, a brick came down from the roof of one of the houses and was shattered to fragments at my feet. Now I have come round to you, and on my way I was attacked by a rough with a bludgeon. I knocked him down, and the police have him in custody. But I can tell you with most absolute confidence that no possible connection will ever be traced between him and the retiring mathematical coach, who is, I dare say, working out problems upon a blackboard 10 miles away. I'd often admired my friend's courage, but never more than now, as he sat checking off a series of incidents which must have combined to make up a day of horror. "You will spend the night here," I said. "No, my friend. You might find me a dangerous guest. I have my plans laid, and all will be well. Therefore I cannot do better than to get away for the few days which remain before the police are at liberty to act. It would be a great pleasure to me if you would come on the continent with me." "Oh, my practice is quiet," said I, "and I have an accommodating neighbour. I should be glad to come. Where shall I meet you?" "At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for us." "The carriage is our rendezvous, then?" "Yes." With a few more hurried words as to our plans for the morrow, he rose and came out with me into the garden, clambering over the wall which leads into Mortimer Street and immediately whistling for a hansom, in which I heard him drive away. In the morning I obeyed Holmes' injunctions to the letter, and I had no difficulty in finding the carriage which he had indicated. The less so as it was the only one in the train which was marked engaged. My only source of anxiety now was the non-appearance of Holmes. The station clock marked only 7 minutes from the time when we were due to start. In vain I searched among the groups of travellers and leave-takers for the lithe figure of my friend. There was no sign of him. I spent a few minutes in assisting a venerable Italian priest who was endeavouring to make a porter understand in his broken English that his luggage was to be booked through to Paris. Then, having taken another look around, I returned to my carriage, where I found that the porter, in spite of the ticket, had given me my decrepit Italian friend as a travelling companion. It was useless for me to explain to him that his presence was an intrusion, for my Italian was even more limited than his English. So I shrugged my shoulders resignedly and continued to look out anxiously for my friend. A chill of fear had come over me, as I thought that his absence might mean that some blow had fallen during the night. Already the doors had all been shut, and the whistle blown when... "My dear Watson," said a voice, "you have not even condescended to say good morning." I turned in uncontrollable astonishment. The aged ecclesiastic had turned his face towards me. For an instant the wrinkles were smoothed away, the nose drew away from the chin, the lower lip ceased to protrude, and the mouth to mumble. The dull eyes regained their fire, the drooping figure expanded. The next, the whole frame collapsed again, and Holmes was gone as quickly as he had come. "Good heavens," I cried, "how you startled me." "Every precaution is still necessary," he whispered. "I have every reason to think that they are hot upon our trail. Ah, that is Moriarty himself." The train had already begun to move as Holmes spoke. Glancing back, I saw a tall man pushing his way furiously through the crowd. It was too late, however, for we were rapidly gathering momentum, and an instant later had shot clear of the station. "With all our precautions, you see that we have cut it rather fine," said Holmes, laughing. He rose, and throwing off the black cassock and hat which had formed his disguise, he packed them away in a handbag. "But we must plan what we are to do about Moriarty now." "As this is an express," I said, "and as the boat runs in connection with it, I should think that we have shaken him off very effectively." "My dear Watson, you evidently did not realize my meaning when I said that this man may be taken as being quite on the same intellectual plane as myself. What will he do?" "What I should do." "What would you do, then?" "Engage a special." "But it must be late." "By no means. This train stops at Canterbury, and there is always at least a quarter of an hour's delay at the boat. He will catch us there." "One would think that we were the criminals." "Let's have him arrested on his arrival." "It would be to ruin the work of 3 months. We should get the big fish, but the smaller would dart right and left out of the net. On Monday we should have them all. No, an arrest is inadmissible." "What then?" "We shall get out of Canterbury." "Why, and then?" "Well, then we must make a cross-country journey to Newhaven, and so over to Dieppe." At Canterbury, therefore, we alighted, and I was still looking rather ruefully after the rapidly disappearing luggage van which contained my wardrobe when Holmes pulled my sleeve and pointed up the line. "Already, you see," said he. Far away from among the Kentish woods there rose a thin spray of smoke. A minute later a carriage and engine could be seen flying along the open curve which leads to the station. We had hardly time to take our places behind a pile of luggage when it passed with a rattle and a roar, beating a blast of hot air into our faces. "There he goes," said Holmes. "There are limits, you see, to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a coup de maître had he deduced what I would deduce and acted accordingly." We made our way to Brussels that night and spent 2 days there, moving on upon the 3rd day as far as Strasbourg. On the Monday morning, Holmes had telegraphed to the London police, and in the evening we found a reply waiting for us at our hotel. Holmes tore it open and then, with a bitter curse, hurled it to the ground. "I might have known it," he groaned. "He has escaped. Moriarty. They have secured the whole gang with the exception of him. He has given them the slip. Of course, when I had left the country there was no one to cope with him. But I did think that I put the game in their hands." "I think that you had better return to England, Watson." "Why?" "Because you will find me a dangerous companion now. This man's occupation is gone. He is lost if he returns to London. If I read his character right, he will devote his whole energies to avenging himself upon me. I should certainly recommend you to return to your practice." We sat in the Strasbourg salle à manger, arguing the question for half an hour, but the same night we had resumed our journey and were well on our way to Geneva. For a charming week we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, and then, branching off at Luc, we made our way over the Gemmi Pass, still deep in snow. It was a lovely trip. The dainty green of the spring below, the virgin white of the winter above. But it was clear to me that never for one instant did Holmes forget the shadow which lay across him. In the homely alpine villages or in the lonely mountain passes, I could still tell by his quick glancing eyes and his sharp scrutiny of every face that passed us that he was well convinced that walk where we would, we could not walk ourselves clear of the danger which was dogging our footsteps. And yet, for all his watchfulness, he was never depressed. On the contrary, I can never recollect having seen him in such exuberant spirits. Again and again he referred to the fact that if he could be assured that society was freed from Professor Moriarty, he would cheerfully bring his own career to a conclusion. It was on the 3rd day of May that we reached the little village of Maringen, where we put up at the Englischerhof, then kept by Peter Stuyler the elder. At his advice, on the afternoon of the 4th, we set off together with the intention of crossing the hills and spending the night at the hamlet of Rosenley. We had strict injunctions, however, on no account to pass the falls of Reichenbach, which are about halfway up the hills, without making a small detour to see them. It was indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss from which the spray rolls up like the smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm lined by glistening coal-black rock and narrowing into a creaming, boiling pit of incalculable depth. We stood near the edge, peering down and listening to the half-human shout which came booming up with the spray out of the abyss. The path had been cut halfway round the fall to afford a complete view, but it ends abruptly and the traveller has to return as he came. We had turned to do so when we saw a Swiss lad come running along it with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of the hotel which we had just left and was addressed to me by the landlord. It appeared that within a very few minutes of our leaving, an English lady had arrived who was in the last stages of consumption. A sudden hemorrhage had overtaken her. It was thought that she could hardly live a few hours, but it would be a great consolation to her to see an English doctor, and if I would only return, etc., etc., etc. The good Stuyler assured me in a postscript that he would himself look upon my compliance as a very great favour. The appeal was one which could not be ignored. Yet I had my scruples about leaving Holmes. It was finally agreed, however, that he should retain the young Swiss messenger with him as guide and companion while I returned to Maringen. As I turned away, I saw Holmes with his back against a rock and his arms folded, gazing down at the rush of the waters. It was the last that I was ever destined to see of him in this world. When I was near the bottom of the descent, I looked back. It was impossible from that position to see the fall, but I could see the curving path which winds over the shoulder of the hills and leads to it. Along this a man was, I remember, walking very rapidly. I noted him and the energy with which he walked, but he passed from my mind again as I hurried on upon my errand. It may have been a little over an hour before I reached Maringen. Old Stuyler was standing at the porch of his hotel. "Well," said I, as I came hurrying up, "I trust that she's no worse." A look of surprise passed over his face, and at the first quiver of his eyebrows my heart turned to lead in my breast. "You did not write this?" I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. "There is no sick Englishwoman in the hotel?" "Certainly not," he cried. "But it has the hotel mark upon it." "Ah, it must have been written by that tall Englishman who came in after you had gone. He said—" But I waited for none of the landlord's explanation. In a tingle of fear, I was already running down the village street. It had taken me an hour to come down. For all my efforts, 2 more had passed before I found myself at the fall of Reichenbach once more. There was Holmes' alpine stock still leaning against the rock by which I had left him. But there was no sign of him, and it was in vain that I shouted. My only answer was my own voice reverberating in a rolling echo from the cliffs around me. It was the sight of that alpine stock which turned me cold and sick. He had not gone to Rosenley then. He had remained on that 3-foot path with sheer wall on one side and sheer drop on the other until his enemy had overtaken him. The young Swiss had gone too. Who was to tell what had happened then? I stood for a minute or two to collect myself, for I was dazed with the horror of the thing. Then I began to think of Holmes' own methods and to try to practice them in reading this tragedy. It was, alas, only too easy to do. The blackish soil is kept forever soft by the incessant drift of spray, and a bird would leave its tread upon it. 2 lines of footmarks were clearly marked along the farther end of the path, both leading away from me. There were none returning. A few yards from the end, the soil was all ploughed up into a patch of mud, and the brambles and ferns which fringed the chasm were torn and bedraggled. I lay upon my face and peered down into the spray spouting up all around me. It had darkened since I left, and now I could only see here and there the glistening of moisture upon the black walls, and far away down at the end of the shaft the gleam of the broken water. I shouted, but only that same half-human cry of the fall was borne back to my ears. But it was destined that I should, after all, have a last word of greeting from my friend and comrade. From the top of a boulder, the gleam of something bright caught my eye, and, raising my hand, I found that it came from the silver cigarette case which he used to carry. As I took it up, a small square of paper upon which it had lain fluttered down to the ground. Unfolding it, I found that it consisted of 3 pages torn from his notebook and addressed to me. "My dear Watson," it said, "I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of those questions which lie before us. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you. I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion to it could be more congenial to me than this. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was quite convinced that the letter from Maringa was a hoax. I made every disposition of my property before leaving England and handed it to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, yours very sincerely, Sherlock Holmes." A few words may suffice to tell the little that remains. An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the two men ended, as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation, in their reeling over locked in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation, whom I shall ever regard as the best and wisest man whom I have ever known. Here dwell together still 2 men of note, who never lived and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote that age before the world went all awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears attuned to catch the distant view. Hallo! England is England yet for all our fears. Only those things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly gas lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these 2 survive. And it is always 1895.